Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso. Got a lot to get to on this episode. If you missed our last one, Daniel and I spent some time recording in the Yankee Stadium press box on a cold Saturday evening, breaking down a 22-10 victory for the Nittany Lions over Clemson. They finished their season 7-6. We're going to have some other takeaways from that game coming up. Mark Brennan would normally join us the first episode after a post-game podcast. He's got some family stuff going on early here in the week to close out 2025. So we got Tyler Calvaruso here. There's recruiting to discuss. There's transfer portal stuff to discuss. So we got a lot to get to. But first and foremost, Daniel, thanks again for hanging with me late in Yankee Stadium before they told us to get out of the building. We got our post-game podcast up, and we're now 2 days plus removed from watching Penn State close out their season with the fourth consecutive win. Are there some storylines from that game? Are there some moments from that game that have kind of stuck with you as you digest what we witnessed out there?
Yeah, I think the one thing that stands out to me is the national attention maybe that Terry Smith has gotten, for sticking things out as the interim, for getting the team across the finish line. I know that Kirk Herbstreit had some comments about Terry Smith and Penn State over these last couple of days that were getting shared around. So I think that you just look at how impressive it was for this team to get to the end. I think that when we're in that press conference room with Pat Kraft on October 13th. I think a lot of us are thinking that 3-9 is in play for this team, just given how things had looked, where things were, and for it to end at 7-6. I think that really speaks to something. I think the other thing too is that winning games, no matter what, is fun. And I think you look at some of the photos that the players have on social media. They had victory cigars in the Yankee Stadium locker or clubhouse locker room, whatever you want to call it. They're posing with the Bad Boy Mower sign. Everyone had their turn with the trophy. I think that while it's easy to say that games are meaningless, and it's easy to say that things don't matter. And I'm probably guilty of it too, where I say that, I get it when a guy opts out of a game or doesn't want to play. Once you get between the lines, I think those competitive juices, they do start flowing. And, there is something to be said about ending a season by raising a trophy, even if it is, December 27th instead of January 19th, and it's really cold in New York instead of warm in Florida. But there is something to say about that for these guys and how they ended the year.
There was no one in mid-August projecting that Penn State would be having feelings of joy while Terry Smith, the head coach at the moment, would be getting covered in grass clippings by his players at the end of the game. But that was genuine. That's where they were when you start 3-6 and you work your way to 7-6 and deal through some of the adversity. And also, I think part of it is knowing for Terry Smith that was the end of the road for a lot of the staff members that helped him right the ship, that he has spent a decade in some cases essentially working alongside. And for a lot of those players, whether they knew it at the time, that this was not going to be maybe a fit for them anymore. Some guys who've been around the program for a while that haven't played a bunch, some guys who have played a lot, a lot of conclusions to careers here for the Nittany Lions. I think that had to be part of the emotions as well for Terry Smith and then everyone involved out there. And we continue to learn more about this team. This was a chance, really, as we discussed a little bit, to kind of have a spring ball vibe to it, because there's a lot of young players that normally wouldn't play in a bunch. Running back is a primary example of that, but so is the offensive line. So is the defensive line. The defensive backfield. We saw younger pieces playing extended reps. And Tyler, you are very familiar with so many of the young components of this roster because of your coverage, Lions247 as our recruiting insider. So I'm curious, as you had a chance to watch that game and see Penn State pick up a 12-point victory, who were the younger guys that really piqued your interest and had you curious about how Matt Campbell is going to approach things with them moving forward?
Quentin Martin, obviously, going over the century mark, rushing over for over 100 yards. He was unleashed for, I think, really the first time during his time at Penn State, and it went really, really well for him. He showcased the dynamic ability that he has, more than 5 yards per carry on the ground. Just a really, really strong showing from him. And I think it makes him maybe more of an important factor in the retention conversation moving forward, because there's no doubt the kid has all the raw physical talent to succeed at the power forward level. And I think he showed that during the Pinstripe Bowl. I thought Vabu Torre played really well at safety. I thought Jameer Joseph did really well at corner. It was a really interesting performance from Torrey. He was making plays all over the place. He had a tackle for loss. He had a sack. So he really caught my eye and was very impressive. I mean, Jalen Harvey, that play that he made in the backfield, big time hit. I think he has a very bright future on the defensive line, assuming he stays at Penn State. I think that this staff can get him coached up and get the most out of him. So Harvey was the guy defensively, at least up front, really caught my eye. And I mean, I always talk about him. I feel Ryan Barker, man, it could not have been easy to kick in those conditions on that field in that weather. And he was money, as he has been throughout his tenure at Penn State. I posted about it on Twitter. I've said it here on the pod countless times. Tyler, you've written about it. Daniel, I'm sure you've written about it too. Keeping him around is just so important. It's so difficult to find college kickers with consistency that Ryan Barker has brought to the table since he stepped into the starting kicker role at Penn State. So he just continues to showcase his value on a weekly basis. So those are the younger guys that I had circled from the Pinstripe Bowl. It was really nice to see those younger guys out there contributing and showing what they could do and be parts of this future for this program.
Had a story up at Lions247.com on Monday about Quentin Martin with some perspective from him on the opportunity that he had on Saturday in the Pinstripe Bowl, and some of those around him who have seen him kind of work behind the scenes and getting to this point. Remember, 0 offensive snaps through 12 regular season games, 20 carries, 101 yards against Clemson on Saturday in that bowl victory. And as we addressed afterwards, he's one of the many players who essentially told us, I got to sort through my options. I got to see what's going to make sense for me in 2026. He did tell us that he has heard from Matt Campbell in a team meeting setting, but as of that Saturday evening interview session, he had not gone one-on-one with the Nittany Lions new coach, who, you think about it now, he's in crunch time for things. And Daniel, we're coming up on this transfer portal window. It has been circled as a key date for us really since the coaching change took place back in mid-October, that this was a time when we were going to learn a lot about the complexion of the Penn State 2026 team in terms of roster retention and a mass exodus. I think we're now backing off the stance that we're going to see a mass exodus based on some of the feedback we've gotten in the last recent weeks when we've had Matt Campbell settling into town. We've had Terry Smith being kind of a stabilizing force with his staying on the roster moving forward. But Daniel, let's be honest, there is still going to be quite a bit of movement. Some of these names will be expected. We'll get into some of those in a bit. But the coaching staff has a new face, and Deanton Lynn is going to be the defensive coordinator. Report surfacing on Monday. We were able to confirm it at Lions247.com as well. And so, Daniel, to me, this was something that a lot of people were nervous about on our board. I think when we discussed it really off the podcast and probably on the podcast a bit, we wondered what this would look like if you didn't have that key piece filled when the transfer portal window opened. And so, a couple things here. Timing works out well for the Penn State, gives you a little bit of headway going into this transfer portal window. And number two, this was clearly worth the patience on both ends here. We have been reporting for a couple weeks that Deanton Lynn was the focal point for Penn State defensive coordinator search. We had mentioned that the buyout situation in his contract at USC. Remember, he got a new contract about a year ago, and when other teams were pushing, when Penn State was involved there too, to stay at USC. So the buyout thing was one thing. There were other suitors potentially involved here, other hats on the table, as it were. But Daniel, he lands with Penn State. And what's the initial, you think, bounce of this move for Penn State football?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big positive for Penn State. I don't think the splash is necessarily as big as a year ago when you get Jim Knowles from the reigning national champions, like a week after that game ended. But I do think that this is a move that you're bringing another young presence onto your staff. I think that it's one that you can really look at. Like, I know that he has probably head coaching aspirations, and I think he has been labeled by some people as a future head coach in the sport, whether that's NFL or college. But I think that bringing someone in, to his alma mater, someone who is on the younger side, I think that you can maybe project this out, a little bit more. I think that for the most part, Penn State, it seems like with some of the moves that they're making, like they don't want to be in the position where guys are getting poached off of their staff. So they're going to take care of them. So I think that it's, hopefully for Penn State, maybe a little bit of a stabilizing presence, because he's going to be the fourth defensive coordinator in 4 years. Some of those changes were good. Like when Brent Pry is getting a head coaching job at Virginia Tech, when Manny Diaz is getting a head coaching job at Duke, that reflects well on your program. And that means that things are going well. Now it's just how things work in football, especially, where if you have success, it's going to lead to opportunities for guys that are leading to that success. But I think bringing Lynn in, I think it puts you in a good situation long term. I think that he's someone that has done good things at UCLA and USC, playing opposite two offenses that could make things difficult at times for a defense. And I think that bringing that to Penn State, that sort of flexibility, that sort of knowledge of how to do different things in different situations, I think bodes well. I am curious, what this means maybe for some of the players in terms of, would this sway someone who is looking elsewhere to maybe stick around? Like, are guys willing to hear out a new DC, or is it, all right, like it's too late anyway, like we're leaving, we're out of here. We'll see. But I do think that in terms of maybe player acquisition, this is pretty significant in terms of showing someone, hey, you come here, this is who you'll be playing for, this is what he's done.
His college football roots, of course, are in-state college. As a former Nittany Lions defensive back, you look at the potential defensive staff that Penn State working with here. We don't know how Terry Smith fits in, but he's been on that side of the ball for the last dozen years. We don't know what his position role is just yet for 2026, but of course, he is a Nittany Lions letterman. Got Dan Connor in the linebackers room, former Penn State linebacker star Jordan Lucas, who's been the cornerbacks coach since Terry Smith stepped up to be the interim head coach, has been working with cornerbacks. And of course, Dion Barnes, who we'll get to in a minute, another former Nittany Lions player who is now moving on after the Pinstripe Bowl. We will talk about that. But continuing on Lynn, although he has these roots here in Happy Valley, he really sharpened his teeth in this profession in the NFL. Had a chance to go and spend some time on rosters with the New York Jets, over in the CFL with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. It was a pretty short-lived playing career, but by the time he's 24 years old, he's an assistant on an NFL staff, and eventually working his way up with some help from his father, Anthony Lynn, an NFL head coach, an NFL coordinator, a guy who's held in high esteem. He's able to kind of spend some time on staffs with his dad, eventually going to break out into his own as a defensive backs coach with the Houston Texans, then the Baltimore Ravens, and then Chip Kelly comes calling in 2022, early 2023. UCLA's got one of the worst defenses around. They're 120th, I think, or something like that. They're outside the top 85 to 90 national rankings for defense. His 1 year with the Bruins, they go to top 10 in that total defense category. There's a crosstown move. USC and Lincoln Riley bring him on board, and he doesn't maintain that top 10 status, but USC was a really, really tough scene on defense to close out the 2023 year. In 2024, he brought them up to number 56 nationally in points allowed, number 77 in yards surrendered, and then this season up to number 47 in both of those categories. Before he took over, USC was at bottom 30 in the country in points allowed and yards against the pass and yards against the run. So what's a little bit different here, Tyler, is it's not really a reclamation project. I know it was a rough season statistically for Penn State, but it's not like you're coming and you got to completely change the culture of what has happened defensively for a program. What is clear is things may have been a little bit rudderless for Penn State based on the performance, the difficulty of scheme, and now Jim Knowles is gone after 10, 11 months on campus. Daniel referenced that you've had 4 coordinators in 4 years. How important is the stability piece, in your opinion, not just for the Nittany Lions, but maybe for Deanton Lynn too, considering it's been NFL, UCLA, USC, 3 different franchises or organizations in a 4-year span now for him?
think for Lynn, it'll be nice to get entrenched somewhere, and I think Penn State's definitely a place that he's going to be able to do that. It's a place where I think as long as he succeeds, I mean, he's going to be comfortable. He's been taken care of pretty well, and he's played at Penn State. He knows what it's like in State College. He knows the lay of the land. If he didn't feel comfortable, he wouldn't have come, right? That's the bottom line. This is a place that he can call home long term as long as he takes care of what he has to do as Penn State's defensive coordinator. I think that stability is going to be big from a roster building, recruiting perspective as well, because when you have so much turnover at defensive coordinator on a yearly basis, it's tough to recruit to a type because you're in this never-ending cycle of a coordinator coming in and having to kind of turn a position group over. Like at linebacker, for example. The kinds of linebackers Penn State was going after under a guy like Tom Allen, it differed a little bit when Jim Knowles was in place as defensive coordinator. Obviously, the more athletic hybrid type linebacker is the way in college football these days, and it's kind of universal, but still, there are subtle nuances that you go after on the trail. And I think having Lynn in place as defensive coordinator seemingly for the foreseeable future, it's going to be beneficial from a roster building perspective. And keep in mind, too, you can retool in the portal quicker than ever now. It's easier to retool a roster or a position group quicker than ever. Guys in the portal are going to look at Lynn coming over from USC, knowing that, he is at Penn State. He's locked in now. This is a place where he could be long-term. I think that's going to add to the level of interest some of these guys. They're not going to have to worry about who their defensive coordinator in the future is going to be. So, Lynn, I like the hire. I touched on why the last time we discussed them. I think it's a great fit for all parties involved. And I think the stability that he has the potential to provide can pay dividends for Penn State long-term. Just eliminating that need for constant turnover from a skill set perspective defensively, it's going to be important when it comes to building these rosters now and in the future.
A little bit different than the last few guys have held this job. Daniel, you think about Tom Allen, a guy who was a long-time head coach at this level. I think he's right around James Franklin's age, but he always got the impression more grandfather type in those kind of settings. And then this past year, Jim Knowles, another guy who's kind of got grandfather vibes in his own right as he walks around the building. As we get a chance to talk to him, Lynn is 36 years old. Lynn is, not all that far removed from being surrounded by NFL players on a daily basis. And that's a place that a lot of these players want to be able to get to. And he's worked at that level of the sport. What do you think about the cultural maybe impact of this? Because we've been talking about kind of a meshing of old Penn State, and whether that's the Paterno era Penn State, whether that's the Franklin era Penn State, meshing that with whatever Matt Campbell wants to accomplish here and his own vision. How do you think about the role that Deanton Lynn can play in that, and maybe selling that to the locker room when it comes to roster retention?
I think Lynn can thread a really nice needle in terms of being ties to that Paterno era, that quote unquote, I guess, old Penn State. But also he's young, he's 36 years old. He's, not too far removed from being in the same place as a lot of these other players. I think that that's something that is pretty unique, and I think can help in a couple different ways in terms of the culture side of things and the locker room side of things. In terms of retention, I do think that when you have a younger guy in there, I think that there is something about that, something that helps, especially when he can say, I was in this NFL locker room. I've been in these NFL locker rooms. I've worked with these guys. That's something that can really stick for players. That's something that I think can really resonate in terms of connections and what your own potential is, because these players, they're all confident, no matter what the star ranking is, no matter what the production is, no matter what we might think of them, no matter what the fans might think of them. You have to be confident to play this game. So all these guys think that they're going to get a shot at the NFL. They all want to go to the NFL. And so if you have someone who has these direct connections to the league and still has connections there, I think that that's something that can resonate with players. So, whether that, leads to some guys sticking around, maybe that's something that can attract certain guys in that are looking for certain things. I think that will play a role. And I think that he does have an opportunity to, play a role with this culture at Penn State.
We'll break down Lynn a little bit more here on the podcast. On a future episode, we'll bring in somebody who's dealt with him out in Los Angeles, covering the USC Trojans, and really going to be an interesting opportunity here for Matt Campbell, Terry Smith, Deanton Lynn. As I said, a lot of pieces that individually excite people, and then you put them together in a room now and say, let's go build a 2026 team that can contend. And you're curious what that's going to look like with these different of opinions, with these different eyeballs, guys who haven't worked yet together, but on paper, really like the moves that Penn State has put together so far in that regard. Now, they will need to find a new defensive line coach. Will it be someone who follows Deanton Lynn from his past, potentially USC, just on the rearview mirror? Or will it be someone from beyond that? We do know that Dion Barnes is, like a few other coaches from this 2025 Penn State staff, going to set up shop in the SEC next season. And Tyler, that was something that broke on, I think it was Christmas Eve, as I was driving east, that we got word of Dion Barnes. And I know we all had the similar reaction. Wow. This was a bit of a surprise for people in the Penn State community who felt like he was going to be a part of the new coaching staff and quasi-new coaching staff, as someone who is going to be kind of a holdover from what they've been doing. Instead, though, USC presents an opportunity that he deems worthy of leaving his alma mater for. He's one of two Penn State coaches that are going to be on the Gamecock staff in 2026, along with running backs coach Stan Drayton. They're going to be in an interesting situation because that head coach's job could be in a bit of a tenuous spot if things don't go well for them down at South Carolina. But right off the cuff, Tyler, when you're trying to figure out the impact of this thing, what did Penn State lose in Dion Barnes as a culture piece, as a recruiter? And then we'll talk about maybe where things are on the field.
Up-and-comer in the industry, regarded by many in that ilk. So it's a loss in that regard. I think he was really coming into his own as a defensive line coach. I think he had some recruiting wins. I think he had some developmental wins. It wasn't all hits on the recruiting trail, and it wasn't all hits developmentally. But Dion Barnes, you talk to people who have watched him coach, who have played under him, who have witnessed what he does on a daily basis. They think that he's on the ball and that he's going to be a really good college defensive line coach for a long time. So it's a loss in that regard. He was well liked in the locker room for sure. Really good culture guy to have around. Recruiting standpoint, like I said, he had some wins, had some big wins. The guy going down to Texas and getting Max Granville, that was probably, I would say, his biggest coup during his tenure as Penn State's defensive line coach, landing Jaden Woods, who wound up at Florida in the end. But at that time, that was another big recruiting win for Dion Barnes. And moving forward, it's not a loss that Penn State can't recover from. It's not one of those daggers. I think there is definitely an angle for Penn State to bring in a defensive line coach who aligns perfectly with Deanton Lynn, his system, his scheme, maybe even a guy he's worked with in the past. That's something that we will keep an eye on moving forward. But Dion Barnes, he'll be missed in State College. Like I said, well-liked in the locker room. His players liked him. Recruits liked him. They viewed him as a relatable guy, especially in the Philly area. Dion Barnes was so big in Philly for Penn State. They won't have that presence now. It's not something the Nittany Lions can't overcome, but I think Dion Barnes will be missed.
Daniel, it's going to be an offseason of change for that position room because we said it a lot last year, right? With some of the pieces they lost, headlined by Abdul Carter, but a lot of veterans left that room. But we kept saying, well, Dion Barnes is back. He knows everybody there. A lot of young players to sort through. Max Granville is one of them, coming off of an injury that kept him off the field all year. Probably your most highly touted young prospect is gone, and Chaz Coleman, who decided he wants to go check out the transfer portal, and then denied Dennis Sutton, who just finished his career in such a strong flurry of games, as we discussed last episode. He's off to the NFL. Zariah Fisher is no longer with the program. Alonzo Ford was a senior, and then everybody else, whether it's Yvonne Kamaju or Xavier Gilliam, who played a bunch of ball as a young player this year, we're not sure that they're firmly having their feet on the ground here in State College. So generally speaking, what do you make of the moment that Matt Campbell and Penn State now face? And do you have any thoughts on Dion Barnes now that he has hit the road?
Yeah, I think when you look at this Penn State defensive line group, like it's going to be tricky, for this new staff to, maybe put things together. I think retention is going to be really important here, because the obvious thing to do is to look at, that Iowa State roster and see, okay, who at these spots can we bring? I don't think there's much along that defensive line. Tyler can correct me if I'm wrong, but they played a different scheme in that 3-3-5 with different body types, and I think that there's not necessarily like the one-to-ones that you can make of, okay, we lost this guy, we can port over this guy who has a similar body type, similar skill set, that sort of thing. So I think that's going to be an interesting way for Penn State to navigate this right now. We talked about the Chaz Coleman loss is pretty big. I think not only for next year but for 2027 as well, given where we saw his trajectory going. But I think overall, it's just kind of the way that college football is. Like, it's so year to year right now in terms of how many guys are going to come back, what you're going to lose from a position group. Even if Dion Barnes was coming back, even if he was retained, it was going to be, I think, tricky in certain respects. Maybe you have a better chance of keeping some guys around, but we all know what James Franklin meant to a lot of these guys and how he was a big reason that they were at Penn State. So we'll see. As for Barnes, I think that it's been, kind of entertaining to watch his rise. I wrote a story on him back in 2017 when I lived in Philly, when he was, coaching the defensive line at Northeast High School. It was before he was even the defensive coordinator there. Like, it was, he was on the sideline, helping guys along. I think he still had some aspirations of playing, in the NFL, of getting that phone call to come back. He tried to give it a go. I think he was in the AAF briefly. He might have been in one of those other ill-fated spring leagues. So it's been cool to, see someone that I saw that's like almost 9 years ago now, 8 years ago in 2017, elevate himself and be seen as a rising star in the industry. And at South Carolina, he's going to get to coach Dylan Stewart. Like, he's going to get to coach some talent down there. And I think that might only help his profile rise as he moves forward.
Barnes is 32 years old. We will keep tabs on what we're hearing regarding his potential replacement. There's been a few names that have popped up. We've passed those along to the message board in the last week or so. And Tyler, when you talk about prioritizing positions in the transfer portal and kind of stacking up where you might need to allocate extra NIL money and in order to give yourself the best shot to pick up a bunch of wins in 2026, you've got a Penn State's transfer portal wish list ahead of that January window up here on Tuesday morning. I'm curious where you see defensive tackle, edge rusher landing on that wish list. And I think the caveat probably is there's not a team in college football, no matter how perfect they may have played this year, that wouldn't line up for a premium edge rusher out of the portal.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be on the list. I think it's going to be on the list every offseason. I could say the same about the offensive line. The trenches, you just always want to explore avenues to get stronger because the more quality bodies you could have, the better. I think defensive tackle probably jumps out a little bit more than edge rusher right now, given Penn State's needs. There are a few names that have been floated around D-tackle wise once the portal opens, guys to keep an eye on. And then same with the edge. You want high quality pass rushers. That's going to be important for Penn State defensively in Deanton Lynn's system. So that's something that I include that on the list relatively easily. Because like I said, one, it's always going to be a point of emphasis. Two, I think if you look at Penn State's roster makeup, it's going to be important that they scour that market, especially at D-tackle. Look, see if who could they bring in because they need to be strong on the interior. They need to be able to stop the run. That is a pillar in this defense. And they have some quality D tackles on board right now, but I think adding is not necessarily pertinent, but it's on the priority list for sure.
I know some of those defensive tackles last year that took a look at Penn State, maybe visited Happy Valley during their transfer process and ended up leaving campus and signing elsewhere, some of them in the Big Ten. Some of those misses look pretty important as you got through the season. So we'll see if they can maybe find some established pieces at defensive tackle. Again, these are premium spots, but Penn State's got premium money to spend, or so we hear. So a couple spots there to look at. Daniel, when you look at what we witnessed on Saturday, whether it was the offensive line, and that was a position that I know you pointed to before the matchup and saying, let's see what we get. And we got more than we probably anticipated with Nick Dawkins, Drew Shelton, and Nolan Rucci joining Venga Ioane on the sideline for the matchup. we really got the kind of the same five for most of the game, which I don't know if we were expecting. Maybe a little more shuffling, probably with some younger players. But Egan Boyer had a long look at tackle. Same goes for Cooper Cousins at guard. We got TJ Shanahan. We got Dominic Rulli going a full game at the center position. And so across the board there, Daniel, a longer look at a lot of dudes. What do you make of the offensive line position? Phil Trautwein is now back at his alma mater with Florida. He has shifted focus that way. And so this is another spot where the position coach is changing. In this case, we do know who the next guy is following Matt Campbell from Iowa State. But this is a spot where, heck, the starting lineup is very difficult to project, much less the entire 2D.
Yeah, I think when you look at the offensive line, there's an element where you are going to be starting from, not necessarily, square one next year, even if, everything stayed the same, but, maybe you were starting at square two. And now this year you're going to have to start from square one, given the coaching change. And I think what we anticipate as some of the attrition that Penn State, might experience there. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, what does Anthony Donka do? He is someone that I think that we're all pretty high on in terms of his talent. We've liked what we've seen from him at guard and tackle at different points. And is he going to stick around? Cooper Cousins, said on Monday, put out some social media posts that I think I phrase it as indicated that he's going to be back next year. It didn't explicitly say I will be back playing for Penn State in 2026. As these things go. But I think that's really huge. Terry Smith called him a future captain. He's someone that we've been high on since summer 2022, seeing him on those practice fields during camps. He's someone where the arrow has been pointing up for a long time, and Penn State means a lot to him. So having him back is going to be important. But yeah, I mean, I thought really cool for Dominic Rulli, get that shot as the walk-on to, play a full game, not just be a special teamer. I think that meant a lot to guys in the locker room, especially his classmates. He's another one of those class of 2022 guys, even though he might not have the same headlines as some of the scholarship guys. But I think that he, was Drew Aller's roommate, was close with a lot of important guys in that class. So it's a cool way for him to go out. And then, Egan Boyer, we've been waiting to see these, string beans that Phil Trautwein brought in a couple years ago, and they got put into Chuck Losey's weight program and coming out the other side. I came away. It was the thing where I felt like I didn't really notice him too much, which as an offensive lineman, especially at tackle, that's probably a good thing in terms of what you saw. So, I mean, I think that the offensive line, it's definitely in flux, but, I think I feel maybe a little bit better about it than, maybe you would think, because they were already going to lose, four starters. They were already going to be in a position next year where you're going to have a bunch of first-time starters, a bunch of guys playing, college football or playing Penn State football for the first time for extended reps. Now we'll find out, is it, a bunch of, redshirt freshmen, redshirt sophomores, redshirt juniors who stuck around to play for Ryan Clanton? Or is it going to be some guys who have Iowa State Big 12 experience who come in, or guys coming in from elsewhere? I think that, you would want to keep all these guys around because I think we're really high on them. Guys like Owen Alasini, even Garrett Sexton, even though we haven't seen much of him, I think that we know that there's talent there. But there was going to be a huge overhaul of this group no matter what. So I think that it's, we'll wait and see. We'll see what the type of guys Iowa State wants to bring in, what they look like, and, we'll go from there.
Owen Alasini, a freshman tackle who really was ahead of expectations for much of the year behind the scenes for this program, also expected to be on campus in 2026. And that tackle spot is interesting because we went through a lot of names there. One you didn't reference was the top-rated guy that they signed in the 2025 recruiting class. And look, he didn't play this year, Malachi Goodman. He was brought to campus without a ton of fanfare. It's not like we were saying this guy's got to play right away, or he needs to be on the field to validate his 5-star status or his high 4-star status. But he's going to be in year 2 on this campus, and I think Cooper Cousins is the guy that we've talked so much about for years now as is he a potential All-American for you? We think he's going to be a future Nittany Lion captain. He could be a captain for this team next year when they get on the field again. But to me, Egan Boyer is the name there where I just wonder what the ceiling looks like if he's here at Penn State, because we have heard it. I think you guys have heard it too. We've been on the prospect circuit the last couple of summers. You get a chance to pick the brains of some of the coaches, some of the recruiting staff here, and multiple people in those conversations this past summer were talking about Egan Boyer like he can become a first-round type NFL draft prospect. And he was only a redshirt freshman this year, didn't see extended action until this Pinstripe Bowl when he got a lot of work at left tackle. But he's somebody I'd really be curious, whether it's here, whether it's on another campus. I think he's got a pretty bright future at tackle. Would love to see more Garrett Sexton, who came into that class with him and also had a bit of a transition process of his own after being a quarterback about halfway through his high school career. But just some of those guys that really curious to see where they take their career. Penn State's going to have pitches to make here. Not all of them are going to land the way they want. And oh, by the way, there's a third party involved here. New offensive line coach for the Florida Gators, Phil Trautwein. And I'd imagine there's some pieces of this room he would love to have in Gainesville. One of the names that kind of stands out to me in that regard is TJ Shanahan. He finished the season as a starter here at Penn State because of some of those opt-outs. I think he started 5, 6, maybe regular season games, was essentially their sixth offensive lineman for a big stretch of the season after making his move from Texas A&M. Did a lot of good things in the weight room, building himself up from a physical standpoint this year. But I think a big motivating factor for him to get here was Phil Trautwein. Phil Trautwein recruited him out of high school. He wanted to stay to the South at that point, and he did with Texas A&M. And then his former Texas A&M offensive line coach was essentially a mentor for Phil Trautwein back in the day. And so there's been a connection in place there. So I think we'll learn a little bit more about guys who maybe showed up on campus and were bought into what Penn State was doing versus maybe what Phil Trautwein was doing here. And I don't expect that Phil is going to leave empty-handed without taking some of this Nittany Lions talent. Tyler, is there another area on the field that we haven't discussed yet that I won't force feed you like I did with the defensive line, where you kind of circle it 3 times in your coverage and say, this is a spot where whether it's people leaving the facility or people coming into the facility, things are about to get really, really interesting for this position room?
Oh, running back, I think definitely jumps out. Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, off to the NFL. You've got some young talent, but experience at the position is coveted. And a guy like Carson Hansen from Iowa State, all Big 12 guy at running back, nearly rushed for 1,000 yards this past season. He jumps off the page as a potential player of interest in the portal. So I expect some others to surface as well. Running back is one that I circled when I put that piece up this morning. Wide receiver, there's a desire to get more explosive, overall more talented, I think. And it's like I touched on when we discussed Noah Pauly's hiring. His developmental acumen and track record, I think, has the potential to attract some really talented wide receivers in the portal. So that's one that I'm keeping an eye on. We touched on the trenches. Linebacker and safety, I think overall you just want to build up the quality of depth in those rooms. Like Penn State is actively working to keep guys like Tony Rojas at linebacker, but it goes beyond just Tony Rojas or one specific player. You want to build quality depth. I wouldn't necessarily say it's lacking at safety right now because you do have some good young pieces, but you also are losing a guy like Zaki Wheatley, and you don't know who else is going to hit the portal yet as well, if anyone is going to hit the portal yet. And Dion Broomfield, there are 2 guys in the portal he is very, very familiar with. Jeremiah Cooper, Marcus Neal Jr., really, really talented defensive backs from his time at Iowa State. They're portaling. Those are 2 guys I have circled right now. They're really, really good players. They'd fit well at Penn State. So chart them closely if you're a Penn State fan once the portal officially opens. Those are the positions I have circled. And, of course, quarterback with Rocco Beck being in the portal, the whole Beck, Ethan Grunkemeyer dynamic. We'll see where that goes. The expectation remains Penn State will be very involved with Beck, who is anticipated to explore the entirety of the market, but Penn State's in a strong spot there.
What about tight end, Tyler? Because that's another area where Iowa State has some serious talent that you may want to circle back on if you're this coaching staff. I think there are some questions about who is staying on campus, who is leaving. We've been feeling good about Andrew Rappleyea and what he's going to mean for this locker room, for this offense in 2026. If things stay the course of what they have, Questions, though, on a guy like Luke Reynolds, a former 5-star recruit just a couple cycles ago, halfway through his college eligibility. Andrew Olish was a big prize for this recruiting class just a year ago. He did not get any game action as a year one college player. And then guys like Brian Kordovich, younger players that we haven't seen much of as well. So as much as it feels like tight end's always going to answer itself, there's a new position coach there. There are some new questions about who's staying, who's going. And is that an area that you think carries some intrigue?
I do, because Benjamin Brahmer has been brought up to me specifically as a guy to keep an eye on. So I definitely think it is. We all know what Taylor Mauser could do with tight ends. We just talked about Noah Pauly's developmental acumen and reputation. Taylor Mauser coming off a 2025 season where he was named, what outlet was it Football Scoop that named him tight ends coach of the year? I mean, speaks for itself. You look at some of the guys that he has produced, Charlie Kolar, who's off with the Baltimore Ravens now. It's a strong sell for tight ends in the portal with Taylor Mauser in place as the OC and tight ends coach. And Ben Brahmer's a guy I'm definitely keeping an eye on in that regard. It's going to be very interesting to see what his market looks like because, again, all conference tight end, really, really solid kid in a lot of different areas. Can catch passes. He's a good blocker, strong kid, kind of guy you want to have as your tight end. So Penn State's going to be – I anticipate they'll be involved there. And I even noted it after dropping the article. There are certain position groups that didn't get listed as wish list position, priority position, however you want to put it. But there's still a best player available model to this entire transfer portal approach. If you can go out and get an elite talent at a position that might not necessarily jump off the pages, oh, we really have to address that. But if it's an elite talent and you want to add that, Penn State will be in the market. So tight end, definitely on the table for this staff.
Brahmer, as you said, a big-time player for Iowa State, a key part of their plan for this staff in 2025. 6 touchdown catches, 446 receiving yards on 37 catches, and he's 6'7", 255-pound frame at the tight end spot as well. He can get things moving on the ground for you. Daniel, before we move on from this conversation with the transfer portal, there are some names trickling out now, and this has been the case really going back to the week leading up to the Pinstripe Bowl, as guys like Daniel Jennings, a freshman edge rusher, Zariah Fisher, a 6th-year senior defensive end, Kari Jackson, a linebacker. Those were able to get confirmed by us leading up to kickoff as guys who were making their way to the portal. AJ Harris, another name to put in that mix at cornerback. There's been some more, including a start this week coming off the Pinstripe Bowl. You had some coverage over at Lions247.com. These names aren't necessarily the most surprising on the list, but they might be indicative of the type of talent on this depth chart that you're going to start to see look for other options.
Yeah, the 3 names that popped up in the aftermath of the Pinstripe Bowl that were all first reported by On3 were Zariah Fisher, who has that 7th year available to him. If he gets that waiver, which you would assume that he would, given his track record. And then Anthony Ivy, wide receiver, who played 46 offensive snaps and caught 1 pass in 4 seasons. And then linebacker Keon Wiley, who did some nice things, but never really felt like there was a real home for him, on the defense the past couple of years. I know he battled some injury. I really liked what we saw when he was out there. Someone who played aggressive, really flew to the ball, but never really got, I think, consistent reps. So we'll see. I mean, of that group, I think you could have penciled in Fisher as a starter next year if he decided to come back. Ivy was a special teamer. I don't really know if you could pencil in Wiley as a starter. He would probably have been a rotational guy next year, which you need all these types of guys on a roster to make a team function. But I think that looking forward, you're not necessarily surprised. By these sorts of names popping up as going to the portal, even independent of a coaching change. I think that even if all things were the same going into this offseason, I think these are the types of guys that could look around because they all have 1 year left, and they could put themselves in a situation to showcase their skills and also just play, which that's also a thing too where these guys want to get on the field. They want to do things. So those 3 names. I think that. I think seeing Wiley, I think he might have had the most upside of those 3 at this point. But you look at the situation, and I think you're not the most surprised by it.
Ivy's a guy that did some special teams contributing, but 4 years through your career on campus, playing the wide receiver position, you're going to want to see some production by that point on both ends of the party. It didn't work out that way offensively. We'll see if Ivy can get it done maybe on another campus in that regard. And that 2022 recruiting class, I know there's been injuries involved there with Caden Saunders, but you kind of look now through 4 years of a body of work for that class, and whether it was Christian Driver who bounced around between positions, Mekhi Flowers who bounced around between positions. You had Caden Saunders being injured, Anthony Ivy, a guy who was a backup throughout his career. But I believe all of them were either 4-stars or top 24/7 recruits. And that's a class where you look at what you didn't really get out of it on the field at the wide receiver spot and how things have trended at that position. Some correlation there, I think, at the end of the day. And Tyler, when you look at kind of the group of players who are starting to leave campus, can you put us in kind of the mind of the modern freshman or sophomore in college football? Because you deal with all these guys when they're making their move from recruiting. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And there's so many different aspects in play with high school, including how much money can you make between 18 and 20 years old. And now these guys have kind of crossed that bridge, going from 18 to 20 years old in a lot of these cases. Not all of them have roles materialized for the Nittany Lions under the last staff. And now they have kind of a new staff that's assessing them and evaluating them with a different set of eyeballs. So when you talk about the lower rungs of the roster here in terms of experience, what are some of the dynamics in play that you think it's worth our audience being aware of right now in the next couple of weeks?
So when it comes to guys evaluating what is really next for them, there are a few different things. 1, scheme fit. 2, potential to climb on the depth chart. 3, relationship with the new staff right off the bat. Scheme fit, I mean, that's paramount, right? If you're a young guy, you want to maximize your talent. And if you're not a fit with what Penn State wants to do moving forward, you're not a fit. And you're probably going to seek a fresh start somewhere else. 2, look what's ahead of you. Which veterans are departing for the portal? Which veterans are departing for the NFL? Do you have the chance to climb up the depth chart with strong showings throughout winter workouts, spring ball, leading into fall camp? I think that, in some specific cases, is probably the most important facet of the stay or go decision. Because if there's a chance for you to climb up the depth chart, you might as well take it. Because you're in a pretty good spot. As long as you take care of your business, you have a chance to make a move. But if you don't, if you're buried a little bit, if you're not too sure about where things are heading with your fit under the new staff, then the portal might be the best possible fit. And then 3, the relationship with the new staff. I know it's tough because everything is happening on such an abbreviated timeline with the new staff coming in on short notice before the opening of the portal. So you're still feeling guys out to an extent. But if you jive with the coach, you jive with the coach. If you don't, you don't. It's something you could pick up on pretty quickly in some instances. If you could see yourself playing for that coach, and hey, look, you stick around, see how things go. I think that's pretty important for a guy like Kobe Howard in specific, because he was tight with Marcus Hagans. Marcus Hagans and Penn State in general, one of the few programs that stayed on Kobe Howard after he suffered that gruesome leg injury as a sophomore, that really altered the course of his recruitment. Because from a rankings perspective, he was looking like a blue chip prospect. He had a ton of offers, almost to the point of like, hey, look, you can pick where you go play at the next level. But once he suffered that leg injury, a lot of programs tailed off. Penn State didn't. Hagans was the forefront of that equation. So how's that relationship with Noah Pauley moving forward, right? That's something that factors in to, I think, every kid. So those are the 3 things. Then, the 4th thing would be the financial aspect of it. And like you touched on, Tyler, there is a dollars and cents element of this that we need to cover now. And are you going to have the opportunity to make good money at Penn State, or you have the opportunity to make better money elsewhere? That's something that every kid is evaluating. So those are the 4 that I would circle. I think the first 3 from an on-field perspective are the most important. And then you've got the off-field perspective with the rev share, NIL, all that stuff.
Daniel, when I talk about that angle of it, where there's young players in a room, they're ready to make their next step, or maybe they're ready. We're going to find out in the next 9 months of this thing. But you look at wide receiver, there's very clearly a collection of those guys. Kobe Howard leads the way, but they had 4 true freshmen on this team. You look over at running back, there's 5 guys who were either sophomore or freshman eligible in the 2025 roster who didn't really get any opportunities in Big Ten play. Quentin Martin, of course, seized his moment in the Pinstripe Bowl, but largely guys who haven't had a chance to go get it done on the field. And then linebacker to me is an outlier. It's a bit different because you've only got 3 guys who are available going into the spring, we think, because Alex Tash, it sounds like that's an injury that could sideline him a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't impact anything for him next season, but the injury he suffered that kept him out of the Pinstripe Bowl could linger a bit and impact his ability to be on the field and ready to contribute early in pads for the spring and what they want to do and installing a new defense. But you got Cam Smith, who is a true freshman this year. You've got LeVar Arrington, the second true freshman this year, and then Anthony Specca, who was a redshirt freshman. Kari Jackson has made his way to the portal. I mentioned Tash being slowed by this injury and in his development a little bit. And so out of those 3 spots, Daniel, based on what I laid out, is there more of a red flag at running back or at linebacker than those other 2? Or do you see plenty of worry to go around at all 3 spots?
Yeah, I think it's tough because you don't have a clear headliner at each spot to pencil in for next year because, no one has said what they're going to do. You don't really know, who your number 1 is going to be in either room. And then you can, maybe work down from there a little bit. The wide receiver room dynamic is really interesting. I think especially when you factor in that Noah Pauley is coming in and the reputation that he has as a developer and who could potentially follow him. I think Iowa State's top 2 wide receivers are in the portal. One of them, Chase Sowell, is the number 35 player in the portal rankings right now. So, I think that room could get the overhaul, but I also think that it might have the most upside for guys to stick around. When you look at the opportunity to be coached, by someone like Noah Pauley, who has also worked with the offensive coordinator and is familiar with the scheme and is, you would expect to be, in sync with him in terms of what they want to do and how they want to do it. So I think if you're a wide receiver, I think that, there is some upside there. And like Tyler laid out, like these guys do feel very strongly about Marcus Hagans and the relationships that they had with him. I think Lyric Samuel posted something on Twitter on Monday. That was a very heartfelt message to Hagans about, what he meant to him and getting to know him. You saw the picture of all the wide receivers together in the locker room with Hagans and Hagans' kids. Like, I think that there is a bond there. It's like, say what you want about what happened on the field over the past 3 years. I think off the field, the relationships there were really, really strong. So I do think that that'll be an interesting dynamic to look at moving forward. But, linebacker, I'm pretty much like, I'll see you in March. Like we'll see what this looks like. We'll see who's here, not only on top who's here, but like who's available, who will be able to do things in practice because of some of the injuries that position group experienced. And you just have unknowns there. Cam Smith played 1 snap or 2 snaps in that UCLA game. LeVar Arrington didn't play a defensive snap, I don't think, but still burned his red shirt on special teams. Interesting, move there. But, what can you get from him? Like, I'm very much like, we'll see, with these linebackers when we get there, like who's here, how they want to be utilized in the scheme, everything along those lines.
Tyler, while we were covering this game and going through post-game coverage over at Yankee Stadium, Penn State expanded their recruiting class a little bit more, and we're going to finish up with some recruiting conversation here on the episode. Ben Whitver, a guy that I think we all really enjoyed seeing on the camp circuit during his high school career, out of Powhatan High School in Virginia. That's the same program that produced the current Nittany Lion and Matt Henderson at tight end. And Tyler, he ends up in Penn State's class, but he was initially committed to a college football playoff contender. Talk us through his path to the Penn State class.
Yeah, he signed with James Madison, got out of his release, and he moved pretty quickly from that point on. It's kind of a full circle recruitment. Ben Whitver, he got his offer from the previous staff the same day that they offered Matt Henderson. And it wasn't an empty offer. It was a legit offer. But as time went on, contact between the two sides tailed off. Penn State filled up at wide receiver in the 26 class. That was that. Whitver went on to commit to James Madison. And it seemed like that was going to be his future. But things changed. He hits the open market again. And Iowa State evaluated Whitver a little bit. So Matt Campbell, Noah Pauly, they already knew him, and they liked his senior season tape. They viewed him as a fit. And Whitver, I got the chance to talk to him a few hours before his commitment. If the door was open, it was always going to be Penn State for him. It was a dream school for him. He loved the program. He loves the chances he's going to get to play with Matt Henderson at the next level. And he likes the fit in the offense. Frankly, I think it might even be a better fit for Whitver here under the new staff compared to the old staff. I think developmentally, I think he'll be in a better position to succeed. And again, it comes down to what Pauly has accomplished on that front. So you put a ton of stock in that. I mean, Whitver's a 4.4 40 kind of guy. He's athletic, crisp route runner. I mean, he's a record-setting wide receiver in Virginia. He's the state's all-time leader in receiving yards. He's third in receptions. So there is a pedigree of success that comes along with Benjamin Whitver. And I'm not saying he's going to be an early day one kind of guy, but as his career rolls on and as he continues to do the right things behind the scenes, I think you could see him factor it into this Penn State passing attack. I like the skill set. I know you guys like the skill set as well. We've seen plenty of him on the camp circuit to know that this is a strong late cycle ad for the Nittany Lions.
Penn State's at 10 total players in that class now. If you'll remember, folks, early this month on the December signing period, Penn State signed 2 prospects who are high school seniors. Jackson Ford from Malvern Prep in-state as an edge rusher, and then another in-state player and quarterback, Peyton Falzone out of Nazareth. Since then, a bunch of flipped Iowa State signees. Whitver, who was initially planning to play at JMU, guys who are changing course late in the college process. But obviously the Cyclones are the key here, the former Cyclones, I should say, Tyler. And so since we last spoke on the podcast and broke down where things stood, I believe they've added 4 more guys. Linebacker has been addressed from that Iowa State class. The offensive line has been addressed from that Iowa State class. We'd already covered guys like Tyrell Chapman and Bryson Williams coming on board for the defensive backfield, and Case Evans impacting things at the quarterback spot. They got a specialist in Lucas Tenbrock. Those are some of the names we covered before. Who is at the forefront of the conversation on those who have kind of flowed into this class over the last week since we last heard from you?
So they added Keen Kaiser, really talented linebacker out of Nebraska. I know his competition in Nebraska wasn't really all that great, if we're being honest about that. But his athleticism at the linebacker position is what makes him, I think, really an intriguing addition to this class. 6-foot high jump. I mean, shot put is good. Discus is good. He's just an overall athletic kid. He makes plays sideline to sideline. I think as he adjusts to the uptick in competition at Penn State, I think he'll be in a good spot to contribute down the road. It's probably going to take a while, but I think he'll be in a good spot to contribute for the Nittany Lions. And then the 2 additions on the offensive line, Mason Bandhauer, who was an Iowa State legacy. He's from Fort Collins, Colorado. 6'5", 260, talented offensive tackle, moves well. I think he kind of flows into this recruiting class in the ilk of an offensive lineman Ryan Clinton can really develop. I think there's a lot to mold there. Could say the same about Pete Iglesias from Ohio. He's in the class now, 6'7", 270. Another offensive tackle where there's a foundation. He still has some work to do, I think, fundamentally, and he needs to continue getting stronger in the upper body. The same could be said for Bandhauer, but those are guys that Clinton has proven, those body types, he has proven he can mold them, develop them, get them to become not just impactful contributors at a power forward level, but in the NFL as well. He's gotten some guys to the NFL. So those are the 3 latest additions since we last talked, and I like all of them. I think there's value to all of them. And again, you need bodies, right? But Campbell and his staff are going about this in a manner, if they're not just, bringing over the entirety of the Iowa State signing class, you're learning who they liked versus who they loved in that class. The guys they loved in that class, they're at Penn State now, and a few more could definitely follow. Elijah Reeder is one we're continuing to monitor, and a few others as well.
This class is going to be 75, 80% former Iowa State signees when it's all said and done. And we'll see what kind of percentage of this roster looks like former Iowa State Cyclones football players who've been part of the action with this staff and Ames the last couple of seasons, and now we'll continue to do that as Nittany Lions. And as we close out this episode, I don't know when our next episode will drop. It'll probably drop at the start of this transfer portal window. And again, I hope to have someone on that's going to help dissect Deanton Lynn coming on board with this coaching staff a bit more. But things are going to move fast. By the time this episode drops, there could be more names entering the portal. With all that out and very clear, though, Daniel, what is your number one curiosity about Penn State football as this transfer portal opens? It could be something they got to go get. It could be something they got to keep. What is something that really has your attention?
I just think the player retention piece of it, like which guys are going to stick around at what positions, and what we thought about those players when they got here and how they project forward. I just think that there's a lot of elements that go into it, because we've talked so much about how players, they committed to Penn State, but a lot of the reason that guys are here was because of James Franklin. But at the same time, we know that Matt Campbell has the reputation of being one of those high culture coaches that guys want to play with, that can really sit down with someone and communicate with them and lay things out of what it might look like. Also, the staff he's bringing in, a lot of these guys are really accomplished in terms of what they've been able to do. And so you mentioned it at the top of the show, where we were expecting a huge exodus from this roster. And while the numbers leaving, it still might be large, it still might be a substantial portion of the roster, it might look a little different than we thought it would, a couple months ago. So I'm really curious how that plays out. Who are some of these guys that stick around? Who are some of the guys that, maybe surprise us if they leave? To me, that is really what will, set Penn State up foundationally moving forward. Then you can supplement it with, guys coming from wherever through the transfer portal.
Same question to you, Tyler, as we say goodbye here. What is the top curiosity for you with Penn State's approach in the transfer portal window?
I'm really interested to see how many of these Iowa State guys come over, man, because we've heard a pretty significant number are anticipated to eventually land at Penn State. I want to see who, and I want to see what that final number is. Because, look, there was a lot of talent on that roster. I mean, that was shaping up to be one of Matt Campbell's best teams at Iowa State going into next season. So I think there's a potential for a lot of those guys to move their talent over to Penn State and contribute in the Big Ten. So that's my main thing. I'm also very interested to see who else surfaces, because we're so centered on the Iowa State guys. We know them. They're known commodities. Who else is this staff going to covet in the portal? I think that's going to tell us a lot about not just the overall portal approach that this staff is taking in year one, but the kind of talent and skill set that they covet in the portal. What matters to this staff when it comes to its transfer portal pursuits? So those are the two things for me.
Good point, because whatever Iowa State guys Penn State is targeting out of the portal, they would have been priorities for roster retention for this staff if they were still in Ames. And so it really is about, well, now that they have a different war chest with Penn State brands on their polo shirts and different money at their disposal for NIL, who is on that target board from beyond Iowa State, from beyond here in State College? To me, I think it still comes down to what does it look like at linebacker. I know we kind of danced around this topic throughout the show in different spots, but if Tony Rojas and Amari Campbell are in play and they're a package deal and they're here at Penn State, that solves a lot of questions in terms of what you think you need to do defensively, who you're going to be able to rely on in the middle of that defense. But that is a big question right now, because Tony Rojas he's confused a lot of people with some of the stuff he's put out on social media. It's his right to approach this however he wants, but he hasn't really been exactly clear on what his intentions are. And if him and Amari Campbell were to both leave, then you're down pretty much your top 5 linebackers from the final stretch here going into next season, including the Alex Tash injury. You say goodbye to Keon Wiley. Dominic DeLuca is gone as a senior, and then you've got those two established starters in Rojas and Campbell. So to me, figuring out where that stands with those guys one way or the other in the next week is going to be really pivotal, because if they're leaving, that frees up some significant NIL money for you, but you've got to have bodies at linebacker, and you got to have more than just bodies, got to have somebody who's going to be an accountable figure for your defense. I know there's some guys out of Iowa State that are intriguing in that regard as well, but we'll have it all covered over at Lions247.com. This is truly in the hour by hour territory now for roster construction and finishing out the staff here for Penn State. So stay with us over at the site. We'll get back to you with another podcast when it makes sense. But on behalf of Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso, I am Tyler Donahue. In case we don't catch up with you, Happy New Year from everybody on the Lions247 Podcast.